what you should worry about is the deficit today is 7% of GDP. When Volcker was around and we had very high inflation, it was 3.5%. The debt to GDP is 35% back then, 1982. It's 100% today. The deficits today, the biggest peacetime deficit we ever ran. Deficits by their nature are inflationary. And, at one point we have to deal with this.
Billionaire Jamie Dimon has raised alarming concerns about the U.S. economy. In a recent interview with Bloomberg, Dimon cautioned about a brewing $35 trillion financial storm, a crisis decades in the making that has largely gone unnoticed, until now. According to Dimon, this issue has grown too significant to ignore, with potentially devastating consequences as it reaches its tipping point. As the CEO of JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, Dimon offers unparalleled insight into the nation's economic health. His observations carry weight, and it's clear he is deeply concerned about the challenges ahead. Here's what he had to say.
I'm not going to worry about that. I think what you should worry about is the deficit today is 7% of GDP. When Volcker was around and we had very high inflation, it was 3.5%. The debt to GDP is 35% back then, 1982. It's 100% today. The deficits today, the biggest peacetime deficit we ever ran. Deficits by their nature are inflationary. And, at one point we have to deal with this. I would beg the government to set up a powerful Simpson balls type of committee authorized by the Congress, up or down vote. It's probably the only way to do it. The other way to do it is wait until some kind of disaster in the market, and then you're kind of forced to do it at the wrong time. And I don't know when that might be. Will it happen next year? Probably not. But can America afford 120% debt to GDP? Probably. But should we wait for that hockey stick to start? I don't think so. I think it's just a bad way to run risk.
A budget deficit occurs when a government spends more than it earns in revenue. While deficits can stimulate economic growth, create jobs, and mitigate the impact of recessions, they also carry significant risks. Large deficits can increase national debt and exacerbate inflation. If left unchecked, they may trigger a downward spiral of economic decline and skyrocketing inflation, forcing countries to make difficult and often unpopular decisions. In extreme cases, this can even lead to national bankruptcy. Jamie Dimon is increasingly concerned that the United States is approaching a critical tipping point. The U.S. has been running annual deficits since 2001, and in 2024, the fiscal deficit has reached a staggering $1.8 trillion. This is the highest peacetime deficit in U.S. history, excluding the extraordinary measures taken during the 2020 to 2021 pandemic, which included stimulus checks and trillion-dollar relief programs to counteract severe economic shocks. On the surface, the U.S. economy appears robust. GDP, a key measure of economic health, continues to grow steadily. Unemployment remains at a low 4.1%, well below the long-term average of 6%. Household wealth has reached record highs, and both stock markets and home values are thriving. However, Dimon warns that beneath this apparent strength lies an escalating threat, the massive federal deficit. The U.S. debt is growing faster than the economy, and projections show no signs of this trend slowing. Federal debt as a percentage of GDP is expected to surpass levels seen during World War II, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 pandemic. If spending continues unchecked, creditors may lose confidence in the U.S.'s ability to repay its debt. This could lead to demands for higher interest rates, a collapse in bond values, and a financial crisis. Unlike in previous crises, the government might lack the capacity to take on additional debt to stabilize the economy. Dimon fears that the U.S. government is approaching a point of no return, where mounting deficits and debt could spiral beyond control, leaving devastating consequences for the nation's economic stability. If the U.S. government fails to bring its deficit under control, it risks reaching a point where it can no longer repay its debt, a scenario that would have catastrophic consequences for the economy. In 2024, federal interest payments are projected to surpass spending on both defense and Medicare, and by 2050, interest is expected to become the single largest federal expense. Even if the deficit is reined in, the nation's overall debt will continue to grow, much like a person overwhelmed by credit card debt, where high payments snowball into an unmanageable burden over time. One key metric for assessing a country's ability to repay its debt is the debt-to-GDP ratio. A A higher ratio indicates greater difficulty in repaying debt, increasing the risk of default and sparking financial panic both domestically and internationally. Currently, the U.S. public debt stands at a staggering $35.7 trillion, while its GDP is $29.02 trillion, yielding a debt-to-GDP ratio of 123%. This figure is one of the highest ever recorded, over 3 times the level seen in the late 1970s and 1980s, and significantly above the historical average of 65.7% from 1940 to 2023. While the immediate effects of such a high deficit may not be evident, Jamie Dimon warns that the longer the U.S. delays addressing it, the greater the risk of a severe crisis triggered by market forces. He has emphasized the importance of proactive measures, stating that waiting for a market-induced problem will force the government to address the issue under far more challenging circumstances. To reduce the fiscal deficit, there are 3 primary approaches. 1. Tackling inflation. Although inflation has decreased from its peak, Dimon remains concerned about long-term structural inflation due to factors like military spending, green energy initiatives, and demographic shifts. 2. Reducing government spending. This is politically difficult, especially with mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare consuming a significant portion of the budget. 3. Raising taxes. This option is unpopular and slow to implement, requiring political consensus that is often hard to achieve. Dimon's message is clear: delaying action only worsens the consequences for America's economic future.
You said that there are a lot of inflationary things that are coming down the pike. Do you think that it was a mistake for the Fed to cut by 50 basis points?
No, actually. I mean, you got to separate the here and now. Inflation has definitely been coming down. They don't want to go into recession. Unemployment has been going up. They raised rates. They were late raising rates, but they raised it very high, rapidly to 5%, which I think is the right thing. And they're right to take their foot off the gas in that one. I don't think it matters that much, 50, 25, honestly, but I think that was okay. If inflation comes back, I'm looking at future things. The remilitarization of the world's inflationary. The fiscal deficits of the world, particularly the United States, are inflationary. The green economy is inflationary. Demographics are inflationary. It's very possible energy prices down the road, I'm talking about 2 or 3 years, will be inflationary. Those will hit later. They should react at that time to those things, but I don't think you can anticipate that. We don't know that that's going to happen.
As Dimon explained in the interview, deficits are inherently inflationary, a result of the fundamental laws of supply and demand. Here's a simple way to understand this concept using a supply and demand graph. Asterisk, the demand curve represents the desire for a particular good or service, while the supply curve shows the quantity of those goods or services available for purchase. Asterisk, where these 2 lines intersect determines the market price. When the government spends heavily and runs a deficit, demand for goods and services increases. This additional demand shifts the demand curve to the right, raising the intersection point and pushing prices higher. In essence, excessive government spending amplifies demand without a corresponding increase in supply, driving prices upward, a key driver of inflation. While this is a simplified explanation, it highlights the critical point. Inflation occurs when demand for goods and services exceeds supply. The Federal Reserve has begun addressing inflation, but this process is slow and may take years to yield results. Whether these efforts will significantly impact the U.S.'s massive deficit remains to be seen. Another approach to addressing the deficit is reducing government spending. While seemingly straightforward, this is challenging in practice. Many federal programs are politically sensitive, and cutting them often provokes significant public backlash, making substantial spending reductions difficult to implement. Reducing government spending, while seemingly an obvious solution, is fraught with challenges. Significant cuts can lead to negative economic impacts, including potential job losses and an economic slowdown. Moreover, a large portion of government spending is considered mandatory, covering programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are difficult to reduce without major policy changes. When spending reductions are not feasible, another option to address the deficit is to raise taxes. However, this approach is equally challenging. Raising taxes is a slow and complex process, requiring congressional approval and implementation, which is often hindered by political gridlock. Additionally, tax increases are generally unpopular among citizens, making politicians hesitant to pursue them due to the risk of losing voter support. Given these obstacles, solving the deficit issue in the near term seems unlikely. However, Jamie Dimon's warning is clear. The longer we delay addressing this issue, the worse the consequences will be for the country. To secure a strong economic future, it is imperative that political leaders prioritize this pressing challenge. If this resonates with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to join our community by subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications with the bell icon. Thank you for being an engaged and valued member of our audience.